world needs now is love, and not just for some, but for everyone. You know, if this month we have been looking at spirit around the world, so to speak, and if you think about it, today we live in a world of over 7 billion people in 195 different countries, over 7,000 main languages and many other dialects, and roughly over 4,000 religions and spiritual traditions in the world. So who in the world would say that one of those are right and the rest is wrong? I can't imagine. In Unity, we absolutely say that this is a way, but certainly not the only way. That Unity doesn't tell you what to believe at all, but simply says, consider what you believe. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? Maybe there's another way to look at it. And so we've been exploring this spirit around the world. Last week, in the context of my sharing, I told a personal story about when I grew up. I had some Catholic friends in school, and I remember at home one night at dinner, and I mentioned one of my friends had told me about Mother Teresa. I'd never heard of her, and my parents said, well, honey, you know, she's not a Christian, she's Catholic, she's going to hell. And I was mortified at that. And, you know, and I certainly believe Mother Teresa is dancing with the best of them in heaven, if that's the way it is. But so one of you, namely Sharon Dunfrey, shared a follow-up to that, and Sharon gave me her permission to share. She said, you're relating the story of Mother Teresa, and your parents' reaction brought back a similar memory. This is a memory I have revisited frequently, and I find it humorous now, but it was not funny when I heard it as a teenager. My Catholic sister's getting to heaven memory. Once a year, the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which she was a member of, would invite the Catholic Sisters Choir, of whom were affiliated with the largest hospital where she lived in Huntington, West Virginia. So the Evangelical United Brethren Church would invite the Catholic sisters over to sing. She said, after one of the visits, my parents were having a discussion about the possibility of the nuns getting into heaven. I think Dad said, no way. But Mom was open-minded enough to say, well, I think there just might be a few nuns in heaven. I also recall them being very proud that the Evangelical United Brethren Church for being accepting enough to invite the Catholic sisters into the church. I recall musing that conversation over in my mind for years, asking myself, why is there the possibility that some nuns would make it and others not? And why my dad said, no way, but my mom said, maybe. Perhaps because members of this order of sisters were by her side when she delivered her children. Perhaps these sisters were the ones who administered care to every member of our family who was ever hospitalized. She was more compassionate towards them. So today, I hope the choirs of sisters from St. Mary's Hospital sang my parents into heaven. Sharon Dunfrey. Sharon, thank you for letting me share that today. So today we look at our last tradition that we're exploring this month. It's called the Shamanic Path. Now, when I put these titles out there, I had really no idea what I would be talking about, so it's quite interesting what unfolded today. And what it really boils down to is us beginning to ask ourselves, what do we believe? You know, these things sound very funny in some ways, but it wasn't that many years ago that in her home, in my home, today in my parents' home, they probably would still say that Catholics aren't going to heaven or Jews aren't going to heaven. So there are many people around the globe that may hold that belief. It's not in a judgment of that belief, but it is in asking you, what do you believe? And are you willing? How attached to our beliefs are we? I've always loved the story of the Wright brothers, you know, good old Orville and Wilbur, who are right here from North Carolina. The first in flight, as our license tags have proudly proclaimed. Someone said, woohoo, over here. But did you know their dad was from a very similar church, and he told their sons when they began to talk about creating an airplane, he said, well, boys, if God would have wanted you to fly, he'd have given you wings. That it's a sin for you to try to do this. And so these sons had to make the decision, am I going to stay within the confines of my father's belief, or are we going to venture out and do something that we believe is okay? Thank God they ventured out because they were some of the first in their discoveries today. And what they did, they used the law of gravity to transcend it to discover a higher law, the law of aerodynamics. So it is in our life. I believe that when we're willing to let go of our beliefs, not throw them away, but be in relationship with them in a way to learn by them, in a way to continually evolve, that we are transcended, that one belief can transcend and lead to a higher belief. There's a story, the headlines of the story said, Texas bar owner sues church. The story in the newspaper read, in the small town of Mount Vernon, Texas, Drummond's Bar began construction on a new building soon after the owner obtained a permit. The members of the nearby Baptist church were strongly opposed to the bar, so they started a campaign to block the bar from opening with petitions and prayers. They began to pray that God would intervene. Work continued and progressed right up till the week before the bar opened, when lightning struck the bar and it burned to the ground. The church folks rejoiced and were rather smug in their outlook towards that, until the bar owner sued them on the grounds that the church was ultimately responsible for the demise of his building, either through direct or indirect means. The church vehemently denied all responsibility or any connection to the building's demise in its report to the court. As the case made its way to the crowded courtroom, the presiding judge looked over the paperwork. At hearing the comments, he scratched his head and replied, I don't know how I'm going to decide this case. It appears that we have a bar owner who believes in the power of prayer and an entire church congregation that does not. So what do we believe? Sometimes it's convenient to believe. It's easy to believe. And then it's like our beliefs are put to the test. What do we really believe? And not even just about prayer, but today the goal is that each of us will be stretched in our idea of God and our relationship with God and the many forms that God is experienced and expressed. And so through the lens of this spiritual tradition, we may call it, that we're talking about today, known as shamanism. The word shaman comes from a Siberian word that literally translates one who sees in the dark. Like in Hawaii, the kahunas are people who let that which is unknown become known. That which you can't see, may it be brought into manifestation. Shamanism is considered the oldest spiritual practice in the world. It's the first spiritual practice of humanity with techniques and traditions that can be traced back over 5,000 years. Evidence of shamanism has been found in every culture and on every continent throughout the world since the dawn of humankind. Over tens of thousands of years, the ancient ancestors used shamanic methods to contact sources of wisdom and power, not just to benefit themselves, but to bring that wisdom to the world and to the people around them. For Westerners, the shamanic traditions and practices were lost centuries ago in large degree because of political and religious oppression. A lot of these things went underground. Yet in other parts of the world, more remote parts of the world, the shamanic practices never died. They have remained alive and well and continued and still do continue to thrive. And there's a resurgence of studying the shamanic framework and ideas in the Western culture today. And so the shaman sounds like man, but it can be a male or a female. It's certainly not limited to a man. And a shaman is one who works with nature and lives in contact constantly with the spiritual world. The most basic tenet of shamanism is that everything has a significant spiritual component. In fact, a shaman believes everything exists as spirit and its ultimate nature. So every person, every animal, every tree, every illness, that literally everything exists as spirit first and foremost. The shamans throughout history have been known as the wise men, the magi in the Bible. The men and women who have functioned as tribal chiefs, medicine women and medicine men, healers, teachers, prophets, messengers, dream interpreters, seers, and the ordinary person who seems to have an ability to do ordinary things or to embody a spiritual presence at a palpable level. And so the primary function of a shaman, if you reduced it, would be one who serves as an intermediary, a messenger or bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world, between the ordinary world and the extraordinary world, one who serves as a bridge or a messenger or stands in both of those worlds, stands in the awareness of both of those worlds and is able to bring that information back into their daily life and in their daily practice. So the Shamanic Path teaches that we should stay fully present, united in our physical, spiritual nature, consciously connected to spirit so that we can live well as whole beings in service to the whole, bringing and bearing the gifts of heaven to earth. Now, the Bible, if we look at it through the lens of Christianity, the Bible does not use the word shaman. However, the Bible does use a lot of things that would be classified as shamanic work. And I'll give you a few examples. Remember the story of Joseph, the little boy whose father made him a coat of many colors and his brothers threw him out. They were jealous of him. Well, as time went on, Joseph finally wound up in a prison. And while he was in prison, he had the gift of interpreting dreams. So the chief baker and a couple of people who worked directly with the Pharaoh had dreams, and he was able to successfully interpret them. When those people were released, one day the Pharaoh had a dream that he needed to know what this meant. And they said, "Can anybody in the kingdom tell me this?" And they said, "I remember this guy in prison named Joseph that successfully interpreted my dream. Maybe he can interpret yours." And so he did. He was able to interpret a dream. He was known as one who could interpret dreams, was a prophet, and he went from prison to the palace because he was recognized for his abilities to do that. Another one would be Moses. Moses, remember, went up on Mount Sinai. God spoke directly to Moses. He was a prophet. He received the 10 Commandments, which would have gone over better if they were called the 10 Suggestions, I say, that received those and brought them down and was a prophet among many. There are 3 scriptures I wanted to show you. The first one says, this comes from the Old Testament, Amos, "For the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secrets to the servants, the prophets." So you see, it was common in this culture that people would have their ear to the voice of God, that people could connect with another dimension and then share that information. The next verse in 1 Chronicles literally lists the words. You can see I have highlighted Samuel the seer. The seer would be a person that can tell your future, see into the future, a medium. Nathan the prophet, again, a prophet is one who could predict something. And then Gad the seer. There are other people mentioned as a seer. And then the next one in 1 Corinthians, it doesn't stop in the Old Testament, but the New Testament, "And we impart this in words, not taught by human wisdom, but by the Spirit," interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. So the Bible definitely points to this activity happening. One of the most interesting stories that I find in the Bible it's an incident that is first found in 1 Samuel chapter 23. A little bit of a story. 2 men, Samuel and Saul, had been very good friends, like teacher and student. And Samuel died. Saul was now alone, and he was facing a very challenging time in his life. The scripture in verse 3 from 1 Samuel says, "Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented and buried him in Ramah, his homeland." So Samuel and Saul had been friends. Samuel is now dead. The next verse takes up where Saul is preparing to go to battle against the Philistines. Saul sees their huge army. He's outnumbered. He's afraid. He knows he needs help. He prays and he does not get help. He prays, he does everything that he knows to do, and he doesn't get help. So what does he do? He seeks out a medium, a seer. But he has to disguise himself because he would be recognized. But there's an even greater reason he had to disguise himself, because King Saul had put away all those in the land who had those gifts of spirit. He had banished them by edict to leave his kingdom. So here it is, ironic that it is as if the heavens have closed up to him. He's facing the biggest battle of his life. He needs help, and he himself puts on a disguise and goes to find what they refer to in the Bible as the witch of Endor. And then it picks up from verse 11. The lady, medium, witch of Endor, says, "Who shall I bring up for you?" He replied, "Bring up Samuel for me." Let me just pause. Did any of you hear this story in church before? I'm curious. Okay, good. A few of you have. The medium, the witch of Endor, says, "Who shall I bring up for you?" He replied, "Bring up Samuel for me." So she did, and when Samuel appeared, she also then recognized Saul. She cried out, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." She thought he had done that so that he could punish her. But instead he said, no, I need your help. I promise you, you will be protected. And so she goes on, and then Samuel says, "Why have you disturbed me from bringing me up, by bringing me up?" And Saul says, "I was sorely distressed." And then the passage goes on from there. So the story, we have to ask ourselves, well, what does that story mean? Well, there's many, many layers of meaning, but to me, one thing it clearly says is Saul's belief system had to change. Something that he believed was wrong, something that he believed was afraid of, he found himself at a place in life where he himself had to call upon it. And so he did, and when he did, help was provided to him. In the New Testament, going back to the New Testament, in the Apostle Paul says, "Pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy." So in a nutshell, if we kind of look at this through the context of what could we learn or bring into our awareness from the shamanic tradition, well, the shamanic tradition believes in the ability to be a person who walks in two worlds, that you are so conscious and connected with God, with the divine, that you have the ability to hear guidance, to receive wisdom, that whatever your gifts are, you may be a healer, you may be a seer, you may be a creative person, whatever it is that you need, that we have the gifts to bring those in directly into our world and then be of service in the world with them. And so looking through that, there are three things that we can point to as we open ourselves to how God's presence, God's power, God's grace, and God's guidance in all its forms is available to inform us, to inspire us, and to work in our lives. The shamanic tradition is based on three things, and they are 1, 2, 3. Number one is that the entire world is one whole, that we are all connected in a state of oneness. The most basic tenet of shamanism is that everything has a significant spiritual component. In fact, the shaman believes that everything exists as spirit and as its ultimate nature, that every person, every animal, every tree, every illness, just as I said earlier, everything is connected. Chief Seattle, back in the 1800s, said, "Humankind has not woven the web of life, but we are one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect." That this belief that there is one. So a shaman would begin to teach you, if you were apprentice, to recognize everything as sacred. There's a story that comes out of Peru about a shaman, and every year he would pick one apprentice to train. And so he had a number of people around him that were seeking to be his apprentice for the upcoming year. And as the shaman said, "Find as many things that are sacred as you can carry and bring them back to me." All of the people ran off running except one. One person simply bent down and started picking up a rock, a flower, a butterfly wing, whatever they found. And the shaman touched him on the back and said, "You are my apprentice." And the reason for that was because that person obviously realized you don't have to run off to find something sacred, that everything in life is sacred. And so it's the foundational tenet of shamanism, and for me personally, it rings true with me. I am drawn more and more into the realization of our oneness. And when that happens, you become more conscious about what we do to Mother Earth, about what you do to the ant that is crossing. This morning when we were driving to church, my partner Tia was driving, and we're driving along. All of a sudden she slams on brakes, and I'm like, "What are you doing?" And then this little squirrel ran across the road. And I said, "How did you possibly see that?" And she said, "I'm a squirrel whisperer," and kept on going. Connected to something I didn't see. But to realize and to be attuned so that we wouldn't harm literally a fly if we could help from doing that, to realize that all of life is one. And so from the one becomes the two. The two is that there are two sides to the whole, two halves to the whole. There is the seen and the unseen, the physical world and the spiritual world. And that the two halves, even though we may not be able to see the one, certainly work together and are one. And that two also refers to us, that we are indeed spiritual and physical. We are neither more one and less the other. And that's really important. How many of you have been told you're not spiritual, or you have to do something to become spiritual? We see the shamans would say that's impossible, that everything that exists is equally physical and spirit, and that there are two worlds. And so when we become conscious of this, we are beginning now to open ourselves to what I'll talk about in point 3, but to really realize that we are spirit. Now, these three things actually monitor the Trinity a little bit. I'm going to look at 1 and 2 now. The Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In unity, we may call it mind, idea, and expression. I personally call it the Creator, O-R, the Created, E-D, and the Creating, I-N-G. That all three are necessary. There is the creative presence, but then creation creates. And so you begin to have a relationship between the one and the two, the created and the creative. And so the second one is just realizing that all of life is sacred and beginning to realize that all of life communicates and works together. There's a great story titled "The Dog, the Chicken, and the Bomb." It says, when David Newark, this is a true story, he's now a youth pastor at Church of the Open Door in Glendora, California. Years ago, before David became a pastor, he played college basketball. He had had a tough game one night, was exhausted, went to bed, but he woke up, he says, 20 minutes after my head hit the pillow, I was catapulted out of the deepest sleep, he writes in his book, along with his mother and his sister in different rooms who were also, they woke up at the same time and asked to pray. He just overwhelmingly felt to pray for his brother Dan. His brother Dan was traveling in Israel. He was almost out of money, and so to save his last bit of money, he was sleeping on park benches. He was sleeping one night on a park bench when all of a sudden he was awakened, and there was a chicken and a dog fighting under his park bench. He couldn't separate them or get them to go away, so he just got up and went until he found another one and went to sleep. Unable to break up the animals, Dan found another bench and resumed his rest. The next morning, a bomb exploded right next to the first bench, hurling it through the air, leaving a mass of tangled metal and concrete. So realizing that all of life is in communication. When I lived in Hawaii, I lived on the island of Maui, but one year for Thanksgiving, I went to the island of Molokai, which is a little island, just for a time of vacation. That night, I was in this beautiful home that was right on a private stretch of ocean. I was asleep, and my little dog Zoe, who's a 3.5-pound Yorkie poo, sleeps with me. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, she started scratching and going around in circles. Never does that. And I said, what's wrong? She was just scratching me. So I got up and I turned the light on beside me, and as I started to step down, there was a centipede about that long. centipedes in Hawaii get very big, and if they bite you, it's it hurts, it's painful, they can be deadly. And so I was amazed at that she woke me up just as that centipede was about to get on my shoe, and I don't know where it was going from there. And I just marveled and said, thank you for this connection between spirit and intelligence, and how that she knew that and knew to wake me up. It was amazing. So to realize that we are all always connected, that there is one, but there are two halves. There's spirit and there's physical, and we are always in relationship. And so then the third becomes the fact that we then become what is called the circuit, the open channel. That if there is the creator and the created, there is the ing, the process of creating, the Holy Spirit, the whole spirit of life, moving to advance creation, moving to express itself. What is love unless it is expressed? What is peace unless it is expressed? What is vision unless it is used to create something? And so the three becomes the one and the two working together in what's called a circuit of exchange, that use it to become it to use it. Many of the indigenous traditions use masks to teach. They will, if you were trying to learn about courage, they may ask you to make a mask and call it that represents the spirit of courage, and to wear that mask and to embody courage. The reason they do things like this, because they realize that we are the mediums between heaven and earth, that we are that which receives that spirit and brings it to life. We bring that spirit and those abilities to life. Would you give me that last song on the keyboard? Reverend Edwene Gaines, how many of you know her? She's a unity minister, prosperity teacher, published author, just an amazing speaker, teacher. She's known for her writing and her teaching on prosperity. But a few years ago, Edwene got sick, and very quickly stuff started going downhill. She went to the doctor, and they found that she had an aneurysm, a brain aneurysm that was getting pretty big. They told her, the doctor said, get your affairs in order. It's inoperable. You've got 5 months, maybe 6 months. Edwene said that she was shocked, but her first thought was, well, I've had a great life. I can't expect to live forever. And she turned within and said, God, guide me. What am I to do? How do I respond to this? And she clearly heard, this is not for you to die. This is not to take your life. This is to teach you more about the spirit of life. She was guided to go to Brazil to see John of God, someone whom up until then she may have not even known about, or may have wondered if that was too woo-woo. This healer who has said to have healed over 1 million people. She went through the line just like hundreds of other people do, and he had no idea who she was. When she got back home, her next doctor's appointment, she went in and they did another brain scan, and the doctor said, have you done anything since I last saw you? And she said, why? And he said, well, let us run tests again. They went back and ran more tests, set her down and said, it's gone. We don't know what happened. Edwene said that she's always understood the law of God and how God works, but that opened her mind to even see that perhaps God was calling her to see herself as a healer, to realize that we are all healers, that every day the Shamanic Path teaches us to remember that there's one, we're all part of that one, that our nature is just as much spirit as it is human. They're really two parts of the same. And so number 3, what that means for us is that everything we do is a spiritual experience and expression. And that all of us have the capacity to be used in ways, I truly believe this, all of us have capacities to be used in ways that we may not yet know of. You see, today, a shaman may be a surgeon. A shaman may be an architect. Just because we label them names that seem familiar, does that make it any less an instrument of working with the divine? A teacher is just as much a shaman. A mother, a father, anyone that is seeking to impart the presence of love is a shaman. And so for our meditative experience today, we're going to focus on seeing ourselves connected to the whole, spirit and human, and sending that presence of love, using our entire being to send that presence of love out around the globe. I send my love over the mountain. I send my love over the sea. I send my love into the heavens, and it returns to me. Sing it with me. I send my love